Increase the size of my screen. And yeah, so welcome everyone uh, to the Indiana Jewish Historical Society virtual lunch and learn. Today's topic is Heschel's Hoosiers, the Midwestern roots of Rabbi A.J. Heschel's spiritual activism. And here's a really famous picture you've probably seen before, or if you haven't seen it before, we'll talk about this picture in a moment. But keep this question in your mind. How did we arrive at this moment in 1965 in Selma? Some people might have some guesses from what they know, but we're going to jump in right now and find out how this diverse group of people came together on this very, very important day in American history. This impactful day that changed American history. So let's jump into it. So what is this program and what this program is and what it is not about? This program is about the Hoosier connections of rabbis who were closely connected to Rabbi Heschel at Hebrew Union College. It's sort of a prequel to the events that led up to the March in Selma. Some of the Hoosier connected rabbis who played a role both in rescuing Rabbi A.J. Heschel and helping his adaptation to living in America, which was not exactly easy. And looking at this period where he was going through a lot of agony right after he came to America and came to Cincinnati at the Hebrew Union College. So what this program is not about, it's not an extensive retelling of Selma. There's a lot of work on that. It's not an extensive discussion about Martin Luther King and Heschel's relationship. There are many books and works about that. It's not a lengthy discussion on Heschel's interfaith work. There's a lot of other great books on that I can help you find. And it's not an in-depth interpretation of Heschel or any other rabbis. And there's other better sources for that. And lastly, it's not about the controversy over whether if Rabbi Julian Morgenstern could have done more to help Holocaust refugees, which is a controversial topic into itself. But that's not really what this program is about. We're not going to get into that controversy today. So let's talk about the prelude to this beginning. March 19th, 1965, Abraham Joshua Heschel receives a telegram from Martin Luther King inviting him to come to the Selma to Montgomery March for civil rights. There's been a lot of brutal police violence against the marchers. They've been halted by a police barricade on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. This drew thousands of protesters, although on the day that Rabbi Heschel was invited to march, there were only 300 court-approved marchers on that day, okay? So including Rabbi Heschel and Rabbi Maurice Davis, okay? So they had been originally, Rabbi Heschel had um, first met Martin Luther King at the National Conference of Christians and Jews in Chicago in January 1963. But in this program, we're going to find out that Rabbi Heschel's commitment to racial justice began long before that. And so where does it begin at? Where does all this start at? This starts at the Hebrew Union College. And what's the Hebrew Union College's connection to Indiana? So the Hebrew Union College, from its earliest days, had a lot of connections to Indiana. And that's why there are so many Indiana-connected rabbis that are in this program, because Indiana, in the earliest days of the Hebrew Union College in the 1870s, was one of the largest contributors. Our Jewish community in Indiana was the second largest contributor, both in terms of funding from synagogues and from a perspective of the number of board of directors um, at Hebrew Union College, all the way back in the 1870s when it was founded by Rabbi I.M. Wise. So early members of HUC's board of directors were Herman E. Stern from Peru, Indiana, Herman Bamberger from Indianapolis, Indiana, and Henry Adler, who famously lent or gave $10,000 to Isaac Mayer-Wise to start the Hebrew Union College. And he was from Lawrenceburg, Indiana. That was the first major amount of money that he received. And Henry Adler continuously gave around between $1,000 to $400,000 for the rest of his life, a substantial amount of money then, back in the 1870s. And some of the early Jewish communities that supported HUC were in Indianapolis, Fort Wayne, Evansville, Wabash, Lafayette. I put Wabash twice for some reason. Um, Rabbi Phillipson would have liked that for a reason you'll find out soon. Mount Vernon, Madison, Ligonier, and other towns and cities I might have missed. So um, the first Hoosier rabbi we're going to find out about today is Rabbi Julian Morgenstern. He was president of Hebrew Union College from 1922 until 1947. Now, a lot of people didn't really think of him as a Midwesterner or someone connected to Indiana. In fact, one of the rabbis we're going to talk about extensively today, Rabbi Albert Plotkin, really saw him as sort of a German Jewish American more than some type of even Midwestern-born American Jew. Because he was very stereotypically German. He was very scholarly, and you'll find out. We'll get more in depth about him in a second. So he was raised in Vincennes, Indiana. He was born in Illinois, but soon moved to Vincennes, and that's where he received his first and only real Jewish education in Hebrew when he was a child in Vincennes, Indiana. So he received very little inside or outside of the home in regards to Jewish ritual. He was very awkward with it. He wasn't really comfortable in traditional Jewish settings. And despite all of that, he was educated at the University of Heidelberg in pre-World War I Germany. He had limited contact with traditional Jewish communities, and he even preferred the contact with non-Jewish German academics when he was studying in pre-World War I Germany instead. His student pulpit was in Ligonier, Indiana, and he later served as his first full-time job as a rabbi was in Lafayette, Indiana, at Temple Israel, which was sort of like a minor league for upcoming rabbis in a way. He was committed to liberalism and free expression at HUC, even with those issues that he didn't agree on. So he was very, very open to letting students discuss what they wanted to talk about or what they wanted to learn. And Heschel referred to Morgenstern as the least appreciated man in American Jewry, and we're going to find out soon why. So who is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel? He's born in Warsaw to a long line of Hasidic rabbis. His father died at a very relatively young age of influenza. So he was basically raised by, he was educated by a Ger Hasid who taught him the philosophy of the Kotzker Rebbe. But later he received a secular education in the Gymnasium of Vilna, and he got a PhD from the University of Berlin and an rabbinic ordination at the non-denominational Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. Ironically, it was a Hasid that actually talked Rabbi Heschel into going for a PhD at the University of Berlin instead of going back to a yeshiva background. Because he had this confusion between his academic identities and his religious identities. And this Fischel Schneerson helped him show that you didn't have to choose. You could be both. You could be both a proud, observant Jew and an academic. As he was a psychoanalyst. He had a PhD also from the University of Berlin. And so he was a good role model early on for Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel became really noted for his expertise on the biblical prophets of the Hebrew Bible, and that really won him applause all over Europe. Heschel left Berlin after the Nazis had taken over, had the Weimar Republic had ended, Hitler had taken power, and he left for a Jewish family he knew in Frankfurt. However, he was arrested by the Gestapo. He was deported back to Poland, where he originally was from. Um, although they were unwilling to take him, and he had to remain stranded on the border for several days until his family picked him up. Um, Meanwhile, only a few weeks before the Nazis invaded Poland, the president of Hebrew Union College, Julian Morgenstern, secured a visa for Heschel, and this allowed him to flee to England and later to America. He only beat the Nazis invading Poland by a few weeks to get to England. Um, and we're going to find out why Julian Morgenstern did that, went to such great lengths in a second here. So, Rabbi David Phillipson is another, he's a Hoosier born rabbi, born in Wabash, Indiana in 1862. The German speaking merchants who were Jewish, who soon later moved to Cincinnati. He was actually the first high holiday rabbi in South Bend. He was the first student rabbi to serve a pulpit up there. He was a fierce defender of the Pittsburgh platform, if you know what that is. We can discuss that in length, maybe in the Q&A a bit. He was a brilliant linguist, historian. He was talented fundraising, and really became the heir to Rabbi Wise's legacy. He opposed wearing kippot or yarmulkes. He was perhaps the notorious planner of the Treifa banquet. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but basically that spelled this disconnection between the conservative and reform movement over serving non-kosher food at a banquet in Cincinnati. And he was a fierce opponent of Zionism and Jewish traditionalism. He was one of the most prominent power brokers in the reform movement. However, surprisingly, Rabbi Phillipson hit it off with this seemingly opposite-minded Heschel, who was a Zionist, who was a Jewish traditionalist, who wore kippah, and he kept kosher, of all things. So here we get to why did Julian Morgenstern go to such lengths to secure a visa for Rabbi Heschel? Um, there was a loophole that allowed some rabbis to escape from Europe. In 1921, there was an Emergency Quota Act um, that started to end Jewish migration, and it was applied and finalized in the mid-1920s. That really put the end to wide-scale Jewish migration from Europe to the Americas from Eastern and Southern Europe. But deep within the 1921 legislation, there was a law that read that aliens who are professional actors, artists, lecturers, singers, nurses, ministers of any religious denomination, and professors for colleges or seminaries um, could actually receive a visa. That wouldn't be part of the total quota on countries from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. So this was one way that many different rabbis, Orthodox, conservative, and Reform rabbis were able to escape from Europe, whereas many non-rabbis perished, was using this loophole to escape from Europe. Um, so so what happened is that Julian Morgenstern wanted to establish what was called the Jewish College in Exile. And what this was that Julian Morgenstern realized that all of this rabbinic knowledge was stuck in Europe, and under a totalitarian evil regime. And he felt that not only if he could bring them out of such a terrible situation, he could also perhaps make HUC into a much stronger academic um, organization. Already had a great academic reputation in the 1930s, but he thought by bringing here was an opportunity to bring some of the foremost experts from Europe um, to Cincinnati. And so he brought around 10 scholars, most of them from German-speaking backgrounds. A couple of them were from Eastern Europe, such as Heschel, who spoke Yiddish as a first language. Um, Many of the members of HUC were formally trained in German or had studied abroad in Germany and had advanced degrees or did research in Germany. So they were familiar with the institutions that these scholars in exile were coming from. And Morgenstern really tirelessly, he without, he lost so many hours of sleep trying to appeal to the State Department to obtain visas for um, for these scholars to get them to basically give them a lease on life to escape from Europe. Um, so here is a certificate of arrival for Abraham Joshua Heschel in May 1940. Um, he first arrived in New York. Um, And so you'll see that these refugee professors, it was not exactly easy for them adapting to this new lifestyle. This was although they were so appreciative that they had escaped Nazi Germany, America was so different from Europe, and learning English and adapting to American society was also difficult for them. And many of them had come from, they were department chairmen and they were really, really well respected scholars in their fields. And they'd come to this country that some of them knew very little about. And they'd come to Cincinnati, to the middle of the United States, where they knew even less about. So they were sort of like fish out of water, and Heschel was one of them. And he had a type of culture shock at HUC. Um, and part of that was because um, famously they would, and this is from one of the accounts of one of the early students who had come from Europe, who was a little more traditional, said that they would bring the first year rabbinical students a very traditional platter of bacon and eggs. And this shocked several of the rabbinical students that they were bringing them bacon and eggs uh, at a rabbinical school function, no less. Um, so but there was a new generation of students that were coming to HUC, and one of them was Albert Plotkin, who had come from Notre Dame. Um, he wanted to become part of the reform movement because he thought that he could bridge the interfaith gap between Christians and Jews as he did as one of the few Jews at Notre Dame. He was born in South Bend. His family was from Eastern Europe. They spoke Yiddish. He came from an Orthodox household, actually. And he was kind of like the Rudy Rudiger of HUC. He was this unlikely rabbinical school candidate, totally different. He was a from a very staunch, very Zionistic family. The school was not Zionistic at all, even sometimes anti-Zionist, and he decided to give it a try. So he went to Cincinnati and he met by just by by a chance of a lifetime, he met Rabbi Kronbach, who happened to be the first full-time Reform rabbi in South Bend. And so Rabbi Kronbach intimately knew the Jewish community in South Bend. He knew the Orthodox community there, and he saw a lot of potential in Albert Plotkin, and he saw a lot of sincerity there. And he said, if you go here, I'll admit you on probation, but I'm going to help you get through rabbinical school. And just like the Rudy Rudiker of Hebrew Union College, he came into rabbinical school with very little Hebrew and really, really worked hard. Um, so, like I said, he was such an unlikely candidate to be at Hebrew Union College. He sang in the choir, and he was musically talented when a lot of Reform rabbis weren't particularly interested in music. And this was a skill that really helped him later on in his rabbinical career. And he was dorm mates with Heschel. Heschel was his dorm mate, and Heschel was quite a bit older. And Heschel helped him with his English. And I mean, sorry. Plotkin helped Heschel with his English, helped him type up papers, and kind of acted like sort of like his non-paid intern secretary. And um, and Heschel tutored him in all kinds of rabbinics in Hebrew Bible, and helped Plotkin a lot with his Hebrew. And so they really bonded. They would go off campus, eat kosher food together because there was no kosher food on the campus. They would go to labor Zionist meetings off campus because that didn't happen on campus. And so he had so much in common with this young man. It was almost like he finally found someone to mentor in Albert Plotkin. And he really trusted him a lot. And every single one of Rabbi Heschel's favorite students, he would give them a nickname. And Rabbi Albert Plotkin, when he was a student at HUC, had the nickname from Heschel, Transcendental Owl, from Heschel. So Heschel had a great sense of humor. Um, so Heschel, um, in 1943, during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, his mother had passed away from a heart attack when the German soldiers invaded her apartment. They stormed her apartment. She died of a heart attack. His sister, Gitel, was deported to Treblinka concentration camp and murdered. Um, and so it was at this point that Heschel was almost ready to collapse. He couldn't sleep. Heschel really openly condemned the Jewish community for not doing enough to help those caught in the Shoah. And the only person he really confided with and spent most of his private time was with Albert Plotkin. Um, Heschel paced back and forth in the woods near HUC, sometimes walking with Plotkin in silence, but spending most of his time alone. And he did decide to go in 1943 with a Rabbi Eliezer Silver to Washington D.C. to protest with a group of 400 Orthodox rabbis, and Heschel was one of the few non-Orthodox Jews there. Um, and this was a huge rally. And so just when, Rabbi Heschel, believed that his life had really hit rock bottom, um, he was inspired to reach spiritual heights that he was later known for. And what do I mean by that? Uh, was that Heschel started to find awe in everyday life and just find beauty in everything that he looked at, despite all of the horrific things that he was seeing and hearing and thinking about. Heschel, and this is from the spiritual radical Abraham Joshua Heschel in America by Edward Kaplan, amazing book. Um, I'll read you an excerpt from this. Heschel could lead receptive students to religious insights. One day he walked into class and said, "Something very great happened today." "What?" asked Plotkin. Heschel responded, "The sun rose." "So what?" asked Plotkin. Heschel said, "Did you ever see the sun rise?" "No," Plotkin replied. Heschel suggested that the next morning they take a walk. He was demonstrating to the future rabbi how the most mundane event could evoke awe and radical amazement from the fountain of sacred sensitivity. And this is how Rabbi Heschel started to cope with the massive trauma that he had been dealt in his own life. And so we go to another one of I'll call another one of Heschel's Hoosiers, a very unlikely mentor and a very unlikely friend because they in some ways they're opposites, in some ways they're very similar. Is Rabbi Abraham Kronbach, who we talked about a little bit earlier before that. He was born in Indianapolis. He was really inspired by Rabbi Meir Messing, who was at IC, who he had who was his rabbi growing up in Indianapolis. He was very close to Rabbi Meir Messing's daughter Sarah, um, and he really learned early on the beauty of Judaism from Rabbi Meir Messing. And he eventually became, like I said, the first full-time rabbi in South Bend at Temple Bethel in South Bend. And he also was a part-time rabbi in Ligonier, Indiana. Kronbach, like Heschel, was a brilliant Hebrew linguist with a real passion for the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, and that's really where they connected. Was through the prophets of the Hebrew Bible that they were both very passionate about. Kronbach was also educated in Berlin, like Heschel, and but that's where sort of the similarities end. Kronbach was a committed pacifist, um, even to the point where he disagreed with going to war with the Nazis. He believed that negotiation would be a better route, and that's what made him very controversial and seem very radical to many people at the time. But he had just a heart of gold. I mean, he would go to homes for unwed mothers and go and counsel them and go and see if he could create a minyan for them. And he would try to help the poorest of monks, the community. He would attend black church services in Cincinnati. He was just a really wonderful, unique person, who who just had a code that he followed of non-aggression and non-violence, and he was a pacifist through and through. Um, Heschel, although he opposed the Vietnam War later and he opposed using nuclear weapons in World War II, he was not a committed pacifist in the same way that Kronbach was. Kronbach was also an anti-Zionist. Heschel was a Zionist. So there were some differences between the two, but in a way, Kronbach became a mirror um, to Abraham Joshua Heschel, showing him what America was like and showing Heschel all the problems of America and all the potential promise and all the places that America wasn't really meeting its the things that it symbolized. And he really inspired Heschel to become much more active in universalism and activism and in looking at the world around him and trying to make America a better place and trying to make the world a better place. He really embodied the idea of universalism and tikkun olam, and so his like I said, his radical pacifism made him controversial, but he was also just a beloved figure. Here's actually a picture of him dedicating the Beck Chapel in Bloomington, Indiana. He's on the far side over here, and this over here, you might recognize him as President Herman B. Wells at the dedication of the Beck Chapel in 1942. This is right around the time that Heschel would have been at HUC. So uh, like I said, through Kronbach, Heschel learned about American civil rights struggles, and at the Kronbach home, um, he met ministers and social workers and Christians and African community members, and Maurice Davis, who was a rabbinical student at HUC, and who would later marry Rabbi Kronbach's only daughter, Marion, um, who you may know from Indianapolis, who was later Rabbi Maurice Davis, um, befriended Heschel as well, and he remarkably, and I mean, this sounds so arbitrary and minor, but he befriended a black man on campus on the janitorial staff at Hebrew Union College and never talked about it. And Heschel was so proud of this that, and he even told Davis, I want you to know this is what Judaism is all about. That's how strongly Heschel felt about Rabbi Maurice Davis and how much he cared about African Americans. And this is in the 1940s. Um, so here's a picture of Rabbi Maurice Davis with his wife, Marion Kronbach. And really, from knowing Rabbi Abraham Kronbach, that really helped him to understand the Jewish community in Indianapolis even before he moved there, which really helped cement his ability when he was being onboarded there to understand what was going on in the community, which was really in a Talmud, of transition at that time. And Rabbi Davis really had a smooth landing because he really understood the community through his wife, who was the only daughter of Rabbi Kronbach, his father-in-law. So Heschel leaves HUC for New York. He would go on to marry Sylvia Strauss, who he also met in Cincinnati. In 1945, he became professor of Jewish ethics and mysticism at New York's Jewish Theological Seminary. It was a post that he held for the rest of his life. And Julian Morgenstern, although he missed him, they remained friends for the rest of their lives, and he kept good connections with all the other people at HUC who he'd met over the years there. Um, he They didn't feel bitter towards him, and he didn't feel bitter. It just was not a good fit for him. He needed a place that he could have kosher food. He needed to know he wanted a place where the melodies of prayer were more familiar to him. And JTS was just a much better fit for him. And people at HUC really understood that. So here's a picture of Rabbi Heschel, his wife Sylvia Strauss Heschel, and his daughter Susanna Heschel, born in 1956. Um, so fast forward decades ahead to Selma, a short background. So Heschel really took civil rights to be of importance to him. He really used his position at JTS to really try to push the conservative movement towards embracing civil rights. Um, and Heschel, who first protested in support of Jews during the Shoah, came on uh, and decided that he wanted to just take this activism from just speech to a form of nonviolent resistance, which was marching. And since his arrival in America, Heschel stated that he was disturbed by anti-black discrimination that he witnessed. This was something that really bothered him. Um, and so old friends would meet again when Rabbi Heschel would meet up with Rabbi Davis again. And years later in 1965, they had stayed in contact for years, of course, but they were reunited there on that march from Selma to Montgomery. And so this is to paraphrase something that Rabbi Maurice Davis said from his pulpit after his march in Selma. He said, "We witnessed in Alabama a scene more stirring, more filled with signs and portents for our world than any other engineering feats of science. Last month, when the snows came, I jokingly announced I would speak tonight on the subject of brotherhood postponed." Um, he was talking about, how hard is it for us just to talk about the brotherhood of human beings, of we all share the same planet, and not let our racial, ethnic, and religious divisions get the best of us. And so the man, if you notice, who's holding a hat in this picture here, you'll notice Martin Luther King and Heschel is actually Ralph Bunche, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950 for his works as a United Nations mediator in the Israel-Arab conflict during the late 1940s. And he was the first African American and person of color to receive a prestigious honor in the history of the entire prize. So that, which is a really important chapter in Jewish history. So it's really amazing having the three of them here. And then you notice Rabbi Davis in the back here, or not really the back, uh, about 2 lines back here. And so one of the questions a lot of people ask is, why did Rabbi Heschel want to be out front? Why did he want to be holding hands with Rabbi Bunch, close to Martin Luther King? It was because he wasn't a petty narcissist, of course, but he wanted to see future generations, um, and he wanted to set the historical record straight that Jews, in fact, were involved in the civil rights um, movement. And if it was just someone, a clean-faced rabbi who didn't wear a yarmulke, no one would realize that was a Jew who was standing front and center on the front lines of the civil rights movement. And he really wanted to send a message that Jews were really at the front lines of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And he wanted people to know that fact decades and decades and decades and centuries on for the historical record to know that. And those are really the terms that, that was really the perspective for the ages. You have to remember Rabbi Heschel thought in terms of time, um, and so in that he wanted to capture the moment and how important it was for both Jews and blacks in America. And so this picture here is oh, sorry, went back. Let me go back 1 second. This is Rabbi Norbert Samuelson. He was a graduate of Hebrew Union College, and at the time he was the director of. He's in the middle. Um, he was the director of IU Hillel, and he also joined Rabbi Davis and Heschel and Selma. And here he is in the middle as a student rabbi in Marion, Indiana. So here he is. So he was one of the other rabbis from Indiana who was in Selma on that day, who was also trained at HUC. However, long after Rabbi Heschel had left. Um, so there's this funny but sad story that happens towards the end of Rabbi Heschel and Rabbi Davis's sojourn to the south. After they left the march, um, Rabbi Heschel, Kelman, and Davis, they went to the Montgomery airport. They were very, very hungry. And the lady at the lunch counter didn't want to feed them. And she looked at them rude and said, she said, she looked at the white-bearded Heschel and said sarcastically, "Well, I'll be damned. My mother always told me there was a Santa Claus. I didn't believe her," after looking at Heschel. Until now, Heschel merely smiled. The men asked for food. After that, there was none. They asked for bread. She said there was none. Heschel kept on smiling. Gently, he asked her, with his soft Yiddish accent, "Is it possible that in the kitchen there might be some water?" She admitted, "There is." "Is it possible in the refrigerator you might find a couple of eggs?" She thought, "It's possible." "Well, if you take the eggs and boil them in the water, then that would be just fine." She gloated at him. "Why should I do that? Why should I do that? After all, I did you a favor." "And what was the favor?" Rabbi Heschel said back to her, "I revealed to you that Santa Claus was real." And after that, she laughed at him and boiled them some eggs. So tragically, after that, at a few hours in the same airport, it occurred to Rabbi Heschel. He said, "You really should call your wife. My wife always tells me, you should call her and check up and see everything is okay." And so he encouraged Rabbi Davis to go on the phone and talk to Mary and see if everything is okay. And so she called Marion and said, my father, he's in terrible shape. He's in the hospital, and Rabbi Kronbach was in very bad condition, and so he had to rush back, and he couldn't get a flight, and so finally, a kind woman decided to drop off the flight so that Rabbi Davis could fly back to Cincinnati to see um, his father-in-law, well, one, maybe for the last time. And a short time later, April 2nd, 1965, at age 83, Rabbi Abraham Kronbach passed away. But we certainly know that he was there on that day in spirit, marching with Martin Luther King, Rabbi Heschel, and his son-in-law, Rabbi Davis. So the passes prologue. So I'd like to open this up to some Q&A. You can unmic yourself and ask me any questions about this program or the rabbis after this. I'd love to hear your questions. Do we have any questions? Would anyone like to unmic?
Hi, Michael. It's Steve Uloff in Indianapolis. How are you?
Hi, Stephen. How are you?
Good. I have a question. Do you know how many rabbis were involved in the Selma March?
Ooh, that is a good question. I would have to check back. I think there was Rabbi Dre. I don't know if Rabbi Dresner was there. That's something I'd have to check on. But from Indiana, I know in their contingency there were three on that day. That's what I know
Okay,
from
but as
Indiana
far
alone.
as far as total number, you don't know.
But I think that it's interesting, though, that there were that many rabbis from Indiana that were there on that day because they only allowed 300 participants in total to participate. So there couldn't have been that many rabbis present on that day because there were all kinds of different other religious figures there.
Interesting. Thank you.
Michael, I will say it was about 15.
It's about 15. Okay, thank you for providing that. There were 15 rabbis in total. Okay. So three rabbis out of 15 were from Indiana. And I think Rabbi Heschel, if I'm not mistaken, may have been the only one from JTS. Or was he? Were there other rabbis from JTS? I don't know. I think he was the only one from the conservative movement, if I'm not mistaken.
Um,
Um,
Moshe Kahana out of Houston.
he was a conservative rabbi. Okay,
Yes.
okay. So thank you, Timothy, for it was 15 rabbis. Um, So Elliot Ratzman, he provides an article from Tablet that is in the meeting chat that will give you a little more context on all the rabbis of Selma from other parts of the country. But again, this is from the lens of Indiana. This whole program is from the lens of people connected to Indiana. So it's a very Indiana centric program, but it doesn't capture, but I never tried to pretend to catch the wider angle of what happened in Selma and its significance. I wanted to focus instead on the smaller angle and its connections to Rabbi Heschel, um, and his connections to Hebrew Union College. And I think what's really beautiful about this is that Rabbi Heschel really proves that there's not a binary between choosing universalism or particularism. He was particularistic with Rabbi Eliezer Silver in Washington, D.C. on his March of 400 Orthodox rabbis uh, when Jews were suffering during the Shoah. And he was universal when he came out and he marched in Selma. And he really proved that you don't have to choose one or the other, that the two can complement each other. And he really showed American Jews that that was possible. He gave a model of that. Um, I think that's one of the lessons that we can really learn from Rabbi Heschel. And that's why I think he's so inspiring to so many people today. And so many of his rabbinical students were so inspired by that. Do we have any more questions?
Michael, can you recommend a good secondary source on the history of the Hebrew Union College, especially
Oh,
the Cincinnati?
yeah. So I'll go to my sources because I was going to go to that at the end. But yeah, actually, I cited you as one of my sources for my first one. So,
Nicely done.
so for a really in-depth look, really Jill did phenomenal work in 2019 on Rabbi Davis and Selma. But there's also Rabbi Joshua Heschel, Mind, Heart, and Soul by Edward Kaplan. Um, Radical Amazement by Julian Zelizer, A Last Generation of the German Rabbinate by Cornelio Wilhelm. Excellent, excellent book just came out this year that goes into depth and talks about all the different most of the refugee rabbis who came from Germany and Austria. Phenomenal book. Much more in depth than some of these other books go in regards to refugee rabbis. And it's an excellent resource, including on many Indiana refugee rabbis. And then you have Rabbi Joshua Heschel and Sources of Wonder, and all these touch on Hebrew Union College and his period there. Um, there's a excellent professor named Michael Meyer, who's at the Hebrew Union College for years, who has several different excellent histories on the institution. There's one other source that I didn't list here that I should have. It's the autobiography of Rabbi Kronbach. Excellent primary source on knowing about the early Jewish communities in Indiana and South Bend in the early 20th century and late 19th century. Go out and I can send you a copy of that for free if you'd like, in PDF form. Spiritual radical Abraham Joshua Heschel in America is also a lot of Edward Kaplan's books. Gave me inspiration. He's written several different books on the topic of his time at HUC. And as well as Susanna Heschel's also written extensively. There's also at Duke University, there's an entire archive of Abraham Joshua Heschel, and also the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati is a great resource to go on learning about the history of HUC. Schedule a time to go there. Excellent place to visit and do research at. I was just there a few months ago doing research on Rabbi Feuerlicht. Rabbi Bargeron, thank you for joining us. This beautiful balance between particularism and universalism. Couldn't agree more, as I said. And if anyone has any other, you don't necessarily need a question. If you want to comment or something on this material,
say something. Yeah, thank you for this. This is really great. And I was actually about to ask you if there was a good source on Rabbi Maurice Davis, but there it is, right there in the sources. So I'm grateful to that. And Jill, I'm going to check out your book. I myself am writing about Abraham Kronbach, or doing some archival work on Abraham Kronbach. So if anyone has some suggestions, I'd love to hear about it. Kronbach ended up starting a pacifist organization, the oldest Jewish pacifist organization, the Jewish Peace Fellowship. And I'm trying to figure out how much Abraham Joshua Heschel was involved. I know Susanna Heschel was involved a little bit and was the contributing editor of their newsletter for many decades.
And I should have also put that I did email and reach out to Susanna Heschel, and she did confirm Kaplan's sources that he was an incredible inspiration to Rabbi Heschel. So all those are correct. But I wanted to make sure that, sometimes, Susanna Heschel's pointed out that some authors don't always get her father correctly. So I wanted to make sure that I was not just like seeing things and picking things out selectively because of my obvious Indiana bias that I have in this program, and that he really was a huge influence on Heschel's life, Rabbi Kronbach. So yeah, and thank you for adding that, Elliot. We really appreciate that. We appreciate your work. And does anyone else have anything to add? Any other questions here? So if we don't have any other questions, again, our website is ijhs.org. Feel free to visit there. Programs like this are supported by our membership and by donations. So to help us create programs like this, create content like this, please help us out. Feel free to chip in. Every little bit helps. Every membership counts. We just created a new publication we're very proud of. talking about a whole article about another really funny rabbi that could be like in a Coen Brothers movie. Rabbi Max Merritt. So, and a bunch of other stories about the Jewish community of Goshen and Kokomo, and a whole story about civil rights and restrictions at country clubs in Indianapolis. So, please reach out to us if you'd like membership. You do get a publication for free with that. Membership starts at $36, pretty affordable. Really, really helps us a lot. So we'd appreciate if you can join. And we'd love you to become a member at the IJHS so we can continue doing programs like this one today and keep on doing the work that we've been doing for over 50 years. So if no one else has anything else to chime in and add, I thank everyone for coming out here today. We appreciate you being here. And if you have any questions, feel free to write me at michael.brown@ijhs.org. Happy to answer any of your follow-up questions. Okay. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.